It's our honor to have you join us for NAF Next 2020 Virtual. Our theme is Connect, Unite, Breakthrough. And that's exactly what we hope this event is for you. We hope you connect. You'll have a chance to connect with the presenters on the platform and with your colleagues via social media. And unite. We are committed to continue to strive towards the unity that we so desperately need right now. Breakthrough. Our hope is that this event will be a breakthrough for you. Maybe it's just the discovery of one nugget of information about advisory boards or internships or work-based learning. Or it's a personal breakthrough where you feel a renewed sense of purpose and mission in our goal to prepare all of our students to be future ready. As we get started today, there are a few important pieces of information you need to know. First, stay connected to NAF Next 2020 Virtual through Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Just use the hashtag NAFNext20. On this platform, you'll also have the chance to chat with most of our presenters. So take advantage of that throughout the session and share ideas, questions, or even encouraging words. Each of the presenters has also provided resources, including their slide deck, with you. And you can access that right here. You don't have to wait until later, so feel free to download these resources and put them to use in your academy as you plan for the fall. Also, be sure to go to naf.org to see our latest resources. There will be a session evaluation for each session, and we'll provide that information at the end. Once again, thanks for joining us for this session. I believe you're going to find this next presenter incredibly helpful as they share their passion and insight with you. Enjoy.
Welcome to NAF Next 2020. Today's workshop will be on creating a culturally competent and risk-tolerant classroom. My name is Sharmayne Jenkins. I'm a life coach and a trainer with a focus on social emotional interventions in corporate and educational settings. And I am looking forward to starting my doctoral studies in the fall. Hey. For 15 years, I've also been a lecturer at the City University of New York's York College teaching psychology. And there I created and taught a personal growth course and Black psychology for many years to a student population that was primarily minority and a product of the New York City public school system, as I and my daughter are as well. And that's a story for another day. We only have 45 minutes today, and I have a lot I want to cover, so I can't tell you all my personal stories like I want to. The outcomes for this workshop will be to offer some practical strategies for creating a classroom where academic and social emotional goals are accomplished side by side with implementing culturally responsive instruction and anti-bias values. And we will look at how culture can be created within schools that support an open learning environment for both teacher and student to freely engage in inquiry, critical thinking, and making and exploring mistakes. Like I said, I have a lot I'm trying to cover in this 45 minutes, if only on the surface to give you something to think about. So here's my thing. Many students suffer from what I call educational trauma, and this results from the lack of cultural proficiency of teachers and school staff, and it hinders their learning and experiences in the classroom. And reversing the educational trauma of implicit bias shouldn't be an added responsibility of any parent. So let's address ways to mitigate that here. We will spend a great amount of this time on self-awareness because what we may not know about ourselves may be informing how and why we make decisions. And I believe this is critical to change. We will also examine the impact traditional classroom practices and assignments can have on minority students. And then we're going to discuss how to bring inclusiveness to the teacher, classroom, and ethos of the school. Here are some of our key elements, and we're going to begin by looking specifically at self-awareness and cultural competency. This is a deeply personal process, and it's one that includes several key elements, such as asking yourself how issues of sameness, difference, and power affect your interaction with colleagues, students, and families, like genuinely seeing diversity as a strength and an opportunity rather than an issue. as well as the other points that are on this slide here. The culturally competent leaders, they work hard to understand their biases as well as their patterns of discrimination. They have the skills to mitigate the intended negative effects on children's achievement and the personal courage and commitment to persist. It takes courage to persist. Our biases and perceptions may creep into our interactions with students. And that can look like both lowering assessments of capacity and less opportunities for some, and higher assessments and more opportunities for others. Or it can look like giving a longer wait time after asking questions to those you favor, and little or no time for those you don't. You may also give prompts and cues to those you favor and just move on to another student if the one you don't favor gets the answer wrong. You don't give them the same opportunity to get it right. There are lots of little things that we do. And as educators, we must do our best to rid ourselves of these biases. How can we expect students to be culturally responsive and welcoming if we ourselves are not? As educators, we must model cultural tolerance and acceptance of all. Simple concept, I'm clear, but maybe not so easy for some to implement. So while I can't help you with achieving the courage and commitment to persist, the goal here today is simply to increase self-awareness and your cultural competency, and to share some skills to mitigate those negative effects on students. It's necessary if you are looking to create an environment of inclusion. Culture matters, and it matters a lot. So now I just want us to look at some common perspectives and the potential problems that they might create. Many beliefs we hold about how to teach have positive effects, but many, although well-intended, can have negative consequences and show us our biases. You can have a model and a discourse of freedom and a pedagogy of mental, physical, and emotional slavery. You create a cage for these children and you might not even know it. So let's look at them. The first one, people who argue that prejudice is not a big problem today. Now, ironically, this demonstrates the problem of unconscious bias perfectly. Because these prejudices are outside of our awareness, we can indeed deny them. And I've had a lot of personal and private conversations with white friends of mine recently. And what I found is that white people in this moment seem ready to examine and look at their privilege, but they're not looking at their prejudices. And me, in my conversations, I always try to point out that privilege is systematic, it is outside of the person, but the prejudice is within. And so that's the thing that should be focused on, and that's the thing that people can change. But if you don't believe that you have prejudices, then that's going to be a problem because you're not going to be willing to look at them. Number two, when people say they are colorblind. This is dismissive, diminishing, and disrespectful. Recognizing race leads to responsiveness to individual differences. Not recognizing race may undermine the ability to understand your students. How can you be prepared to be culturally responsive to different races of people if you have a colorblind racial attitude? To not see color is to not see fundamental pieces of people with melanin. And really what it does is it asserts white normativity. Most educators are white, middle class, monolingual English speakers. And increasingly, this same profile does not hold true for our students. Many try to bridge that gap with the embrace of colorblindness, but the truth is, like I said before, culture matters and so color matters. 3, sympathy. Here's the thing. Arrogance and sympathy are two sides of the same coin. Sympathetic approaches are just like the arrogant ones, where it ultimately means that you have low expectations. Sympathy does not equal non-judgmental. So whether I say these kids, they just don't have what it takes, or if I say these kids just don't have what it takes, it's still the same thing. So don't think that your sympathy means that somehow you're not looking at them as less than. In terms of the model minority, even a positive stereotype isn't positive. It presses students into molds not built for individuals. Now, this is something that commonly occurs with Asian students. Many teachers admire the perceived academic prowess and motivation of certain groups such as theirs, but even a positive stereotype isn't positive if it presses students into molds not built for them individually. And labels. Terms such as at-risk, low income, disadvantage, they often lead to or originate from racist narratives. There is no note of what it takes or the qualities it takes to endure, to thrive in those conditions that they're in. There's no note of their aspirations or the possibilities. It just screams or sometimes whispers, I am superior and you need my help. When you label children these ways, you don't see the systematic causes behind their struggles. You are not separating them from their conditions and may not be looking at their competence or their abilities. When you say people of color, you make us other. It's common for folks to say white and say people of color, which leads to white being worthy of distinction and others just lumped together. I am a Black person of color. I am not just a person of color. There needs to be distinction made. Do not label me and lump me in, right? So here's some questions for you to consider. What are some ways for educators to acknowledge students' ethnic, cultural, racial, and linguistic identities? Why is it important to incorporate their identities into the curriculum? And what happens when teachers don't validate their students' racial and ethnic identities? So when you get some time, take a minute and write a few ways that you can see through your beliefs, practices, and expectations where your biases are now apparent. Your willingness to examine your own possible bias is an important step. And speaking of bias, let's look at implicit biases, because the first step in moving towards cultural competency is to be willing to look for your implicit biases. Notice I didn't say at them. Implicit biases refer to the attitudes or stereotypes that affect our understanding, actions, and decisions in an unconscious manner. And here's the thing, if we are humans and if you are alive, you have biases, period. Culturally competent leaders work to understand their biases as well as patterns of discrimination. I always like to talk about a story of when I saw this tatted up grunge couple in the village one time with their newborn baby, and I was watching them parent so tenderly, and I realized I was surprised by that. And I don't know what I thought. I guess, I don't know if I thought they were gonna feed their baby rocks or, put a gauged big hole earring in the baby's ear. I don't know what I thought. But what I know is that the fact that I was surprised about them parenting their child normally meant that I had some kind of implicit bias. I had already made up something about these people, and I was interacting with that belief as if it was fact until I looked at myself and became aware of how I was responding and reacting to what they were doing, which was perfectly normal. Biases are developed over a lifetime. They're a result of early life experiences, lessons and observations, the media and the news. And we start developing them around age 3. And they're a result of what we are taught directly and indirectly. And they're there and we don't know they exist for the most part. We all have biases. I can't stress it enough. But Biases become a problem when we're not aware of their impact on other people. And they're not just about race. They could be about weight, accents, complexions, financial status, infirmaries, all kinds of different things. I want to give you a few key characteristics of implicit bias. One, implicit biases are pervasive. Everybody possesses them, even people with avowed commitments to impartiality, such as judges, and it's been shown in sentencing. The implicit biases we hold do not necessarily align with our declared beliefs or even reflect stances that we would explicitly endorse. Another, implicit biases are malleable. Our brains are incredibly complex, and the implicit associations that we form can be gradually unlearned through a variety of debiasing techniques. So there's hope, y'all. And lastly, we can embrace antidotes that reinforce our biases, but discard experiences that contradict them. At best, we'll make some exceptions. So the question becomes, what are you missing because of what you've chosen to focus on when it comes to your students and race? When you label students low achiever or disadvantaged, what will you miss? When you have your biases that you are constantly looking to make yourself right about, what will you miss? It's easy to miss what you're not looking for. Conversely, you will see what you are looking for. So what are you looking to see in your students? What could you be missing in your students? Be honest, do you have confirmation bias? Because we all do in some way, shape, or form. There are various ways that these biases can morph into discrimination and oppression. One is by commission, committing an act, like recommending community college to a good student, or not learning ethnic names, or offering different assignments to some students because you think that they'll have more ability to be able to complete things on different levels, or others have less. The second is by omission, leaving someone or group out or allowing very few access or invitation. When my daughter, who went to one of the most touted specialized high schools in New York, had a 96 average in Spanish throughout high school, she was not granted access to SP Spanish. And what she learned later was the class was composed of all Spanish speaking and white students. That is omission. That is a discrimination or oppression by omission. The third is by ignorance. Ignoring oppression can happen through spiritualization. This is my tongue twister part, y'all, so bear with me. It can happen by ignoring oppression through spiritualization. That must be God's will. Through trivialization, through universalization, all lives matter, and particularization. That's my one that gets me every time. It occurs, things only occur in certain ways. They don't occur all the time. Some ways that implicit biases show up for minority students is tracking them into lower academic coursework and the assignments and grading of those assignments. When I first started teaching at York, I was advised not to worry about the grammar or the composition of the writing of the students. I was told as long as conceptually you get that they understand the premise, just grade on that. To which I said, where they do that at? I'm not doing that. But there was a bias that had them feel like these kids could not live up to certain standards. So don't even look for that to occur, and don't grade them based on the standards that you would hold for most other people. Another thing is giving fewer resources. I had a mentor who had a school built the same time in a Black community as a school was being built in another community, and the DOE put a computer lab in the school in the white community, but told her she didn't need a computer lab in hers. And she had to shuffle her budget around and get her teachers to agree not to take off so they could use the budget for the substitutes to be able to build a computer lab. Assessments show your biases and can turn into oppressive behavior. There was a study done once where they had a paper written with a white student's name and the same paper given with a black student's name. And the white comments said they were a generally good writer and had potential. And the black comments said things like needs lots of work. Also look at the security measures that you institute at your school and look at the disciplines. Those are all ways that biases can turn into oppressive and discriminatory practices. Now I want to talk about a really important concept, and it's called stereotype threats. And stereotype threats arise from a fear among members of a group of reinforcing negative stereotypes about the intellectual ability of that group. Here's a little secret. The students already know what society thinks of them. They've been told by their family, TV, comments, and experience. And your approach tells them what you think of them. And this creates greater pressure on them. And it arises from that fear of reinforcing those negative stereotypes about the intellectual and behavioral ability of their group. Are you supporting your students' identity and making it safe for them to be themselves? School shouldn't be something that students have to survive. And I'm going to tell you, it's hard to diagnose trauma when you're part of the system that imposes those traumas. So do you create programming, rooms, and buildings that reflect diversity, equity, and justice? And I'm not just talking about in pitches, I'm talking about in the way you deal with your students. And the faculty, they see how y'all treat each other. What messages are conveyed? What images, phrases, facilitation teams, suggested reading and assignments do you have? What's your seating chart look like? What would your students say about you in your school? Have you ever even asked them? Everybody is making decisions about what these urban students or whatever we've labeled them, who they are and what they need. But are you talking to them about what they need? So here's some suggestions. Connect with students. Offer them some autobiographical assignments. It helps create relevance. It establishes an emotional safety zone. When you ask people about their lives and their hobbies, it makes them know that you care about them. And the perception that the teacher cares is just like life-changing. You need to learn the students, and these assignments help you learn the students, and it creates opportunities for student engagement. And when they feel like you can relate to them and you're engaged with them, they become more engaged. I have found a way with no matter what I've taught to include an autobiographical assignment because it allows me, A, to understand these students and what they're going through better, and B, it gives me ways to tweak what I talk about in class and the assignments I give, because I can now start to support some of the things that I've been exposed to about them. Number 2, brief value affirmation writing exercises can help negatively stereotype children perform better on academic tasks. I've had students who have cried because I have affirmed them and told me they've never heard that before from anybody. And that's on a college level. And it changed how they approached their classes, and that it changed what they thought about themselves. We have to do this. It creates growth mindsets. Targeting their beliefs can be done by things like having a come as you want to be party, or having them write and research about career paths that they have for themselves. I was at a program where formerly incarcerated teens were given assignments like this, and it helped them get focused, it helped them see the possibility, and it helped change trajectories. For students that are associated with poor academic outcomes, this exercise can help them imagine school success, and it can lead to specific ways to become the person that they dream of becoming. Now, a problem sometimes that happens within trying to do this work is that some teachers engage in what I call linguistic lynchings. And this is where we communicate by word, gesture, or spirit in a way that kills these dreams, kills their desire to learn, their self-esteem, and their self-worth. And that can look like things like, well, that's ambitious, or maybe you should be a little more reasonable, or don't burden your parents with trying to make that happen. It also can be dismissing their experiences that they tell you about, right? So we have to be careful. Critical engagement is a must. Understanding people needs to be who we are. And we don't try to change them, but even if we don't understand or agree with what they want. A brief look at risk-tolerant classrooms. A risk-tolerant classroom supports inquiry and critical thinking and allows students to explore, make mistakes, find solutions, and iterate on those solutions, all in an open learning environment. I think a classroom should be a place that kids understand that they can fail. That's what creates a risk-tolerant classroom. I love acronyms, and for me, FAIL is first attempts in learning. I need y'all to understand that students don't object to the difficulty of a problem itself. It's the risk of embarrassment and feeling stupid that makes them want to avoid a challenge. So if you approach them with high expectations, leave room for failing, and model how you can own up to your own failures, they will likely feel safer and they will be more involved. Science teachers understand failure is inevitable more than most, and they call it hypothesis or experiments. Embracing this teaching to learn from mistakes, that's what leads to success for many. Your students are scared of failing, particularly the minority students that have the stereotype threat. So sometimes they won't engage or even try that because they don't want to fail, they don't want to look stupid, and they don't want to make you write about them or their race. Many vulnerable students feel judged and tested, but it's within our power to change this. And that's our good news. One impactful way, let them see you fail and hear about occurrences where you have failed before. Stop trying to be perfect. It's not serving your students. I want to move on to accessing your competence. Many of us have blind spots when it comes to our beliefs and values. Look at all these stories of cops and electives who have racially biased social media posts while saying and believing that they hold no biases. This climate we are in right now has probably given everybody an opportunity to see themselves. And trust me when I tell you this, if you refuse to believe the narratives about discrimination, bias, racism, and privilege, then I am really talking to you. By reflecting on the attitudes you have towards diverse groups, you can target areas in your life that need to be evaluated. Stereotype is a term most of us, all of us, I would say, are very aware of. And it's defined as an often unfair and untrue belief that many people have about all people or things in a particular characteristics. And educators need to reflect on their own backgrounds and life experiences, all of which have shaped their thoughts and behaviors and consequently influence how they conduct themselves professionally. Every household we grew up in, every experience we have has crept into us. And so to try to dismiss your upbringing and not think that it has affected you in any slight way is a mistake. You have to try to understand the impact of culture in our own lives and in others. Look directly at what culture you possess and the ways in which it might influence your perspective and behaviors. So ask yourself questions like, what are my beliefs, values, and religious and political orientations? What is my age group? I was born before the civil rights movement. I grew up in it. It would be silly of me to think it hasn't shaped some of how I think. And that's because of my age group. It has allowed certain experiences. Look at your age group and what's occurred in that time period. And also be honest and look at what stereotypes you might hold. Next is microaggressions. And I really want to focus some time on this more so than the others. Microaggressions are often committed by well-intended, good people not meaning to hurt anyone. Nevertheless, the outcome of microaggressions is anger, frustration, and withdrawal by those who are the recipient of these insensitive comments and actions. Thus is the case for classroom aggressions as well. They are not committed by spiteful and bigoted educators who want to intentionally hurt students from diverse groups, but rather are undertaken at the unconscious level by well-meaning and caring professionals. But the bottom line is that microaggressions create a hostile and unwelcome classroom environment. I want to look at the definition of microaggressions, and I want to give you a few examples that I have written down. Microaggressions are defined as brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether intended or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults that potentially have harmful or unpleasant psychological impact on the target person or group. And here's a few, and I've mentioned some throughout what I'm talking about, but I'm going to be specific here and let you know. Failing to learn or pronunciate or continuously to mispronounce the names of students after they have corrected you. Scheduling tests and projects due dates on religious or cultural holidays, as well as events. I once had a participant in NAF last year tell me that they scheduled their prom unknowingly during Ramadan, and they didn't even realize what occurred until the Muslim students came to them and said that they wouldn't be able to attend. That is a perfect example, right? You are not, look at what you're not looking at that has to do with the students and the demographic of your student population, right? Setting low expectations for students of particular groups, neighborhoods, or feeder patterns. Using the term illegals for undocumented students. Singling students out in class because of their background or expecting students of any particular group to represent for the prospective students of others in their race. Right? Jamal, you're Black. Tell us what you think about blah, blah, blah. Denying the experiences of students by questioning the credibility and validity of their stories. Assigning projects that might promote oppression, even overtly. We hear about these slavery assignments that they've had out, right? People didn't understand what they did. Can't do it, right? Discouraging, and to the opposite end of that, discouraging students from working on projects that explore their own social identities. My daughter, I always had her do things that were centered around Africans and African Americans because she went to a predominantly white school that didn't really talk about the history that included her. And I always told her, you will learn, and when you get to present, you will teach, because they were ignored and it was often discouraged. And I made her hold to that because she deserved it. Assuming all students have access to and are proficient in the use of computers and the applications. In New York, when they decided to do the remote learning, they quickly realized that that wasn't going to work because there was such a huge swath of the population who didn't have computers and didn't know how to use them. And they had companies that graciously donated tablets for the students, but a lot of them didn't even have internet access. So that became another hurdle to have to be overcome, right? These are things that are microaggressions, not because you intended to exclude or to point out or to separate somebody, but because you just don't even think about your whole population, right? And lastly, I want to talk about having students engaged in required readings where the protagonists are always white. And lastly, stop making cultural personal expressions wrong. Talking hairstyles, clothing, slang, different gestures. I talk with my hands. If we were in person, forget about it. This would be a lot of what you store. Stop making it wrong. Stop making dances and different things wrong. I always talk about a story where I say y'all a lot. Somebody came to me and said, what does y'all mean? I said the same thing as use, and they got it. And they got it beforehand, but they were being a smarty pants. Don't do that. We all have colloquialisms. We all have slang. Don't make one person's wrong over another person's unless it's derogatory or it's hurting somebody. Micro insults. Micro insults are of the less obvious nature, and it puts people of color in a psychological bond, because while a person may feel insulted, she is not exactly sure why. And the perpetrator doesn't acknowledge that anything has happened because he is not aware he's been offensive, right? The person of color gets caught in a catch-22. If she confronts the perpetrator will deny it. And then the person of color might start to question whether it actually happened, and the result is generally confusion, anger, and an overall zapping of energy. Micro insults are basically behaviors, actions, or verbal comments that convey rudeness, insensitivity, or demean a person's group or social identity or heritage. An example might be you making up a nickname that might be a little derogatory, but you don't think so, you think it's cute. Micro invalidations are actions that exclude, negate, or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of people who represent different groups. Look at yourself. Think about yourself. Assess where you are with these when you have a chance. You really need to spend some time with this material. And now I want to look at cultural competence skills areas. And there are 5 basic cultural competence skill areas. They apply to individual educators as well as the schools they work in and the educational system as a whole. Growth in one area tends to support growth in another. First is valuing diversity. Accepting and respecting differences is important. Different cultural backgrounds and customs, different ways of communicating, and different traditionals, ways of being, and values are all important. Don't look at them as a hurdle to get over. Value them and look at how the richness of the population can really, really help your learning and the learning of others, and also broaden and expand it. Becoming culturally self-aware. Culture is the sum total of an individual's experiences, knowledge, skills, belief, values, and interests, and it shapes educators' sense of who they are and how they fit in with their families, school, community, and society. And we got to be mindful of cultural conflicts, and cultural conflicts exist between the culture of many students of color and the dominant culture of the school they attend. Verbal and nonverbal communication differences can create cultural conflict and misinterpretation between school staff and students of different color, right? Whether it's or saying dope or fire, or maybe inadvertently, calling you sis, or hearing them say son. Much of the intellect that's heralded in these students' communities and homes is non-academic knowledge, and it's brilliance that isn't acknowledged by educators. Many leave opportunities on the table, opportunities for them and the students to flourish and ultimately attach themselves to traditional education, and opportunities for students, teachers to connect, right? I don't care if it's art, graffiti, rapping, their street knowledge, their cultural expressions, the things they memorize. We need to let students know that they can be themselves and that they are brilliant in and of the things that they know, even if it's not traditional. They can embrace their culture and their street persona and embrace academic rigor. We should create an environment where this is accepted and have assignments that meet them where they are. And there are some other areas that I want us to look at in terms of assessing and improving cultural competency skill areas. You have the dynamic of differences, knowing what can go wrong in our cross-cultural communication and how to respond to those situations. You need to develop that. Knowledge of the children's cultures. Educators must have some base knowledge of their students' culture so that the students' behaviors can be understood in their proper cultural context. And lastly, institutionalizing cultural competence and adapting to diversity. Culturally competent educators and the institutions they work in can take a step further by institutionalizing the cultural knowledge so they can adapt to diversity and better serve their populations. Stop doing what you feel like would be best and what you think is good and reflect what the students tell you is good and show you is good. So when you get a chance, just take a minute and write a few ways that you can see through your beliefs, practices, and expectations where your biases are now apparent. Whether it's race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, religious or economic backgrounds, all of that we have, it leads to our beliefs, our practices, and our expectations. And it leads the children, their possession of those things leads them to beliefs, practices, and expectations for educators. Here's some questions for you to consider. Take a quick look at them. And I'm going to move on because I'm running late. Here's some strategies for success. How can you teach inclusively? Be reflective by asking yourself the following. How might your own culture-bound assumptions influence your interactions with students? How might the background and experiences of your students influence their motivation, engagement, and learning in your classroom? Look at those things. Also, how can you modify course materials, activities, assignments, and or exams to be more accessible to students in your class? And lastly, how have you made or encouraged your students to understand they have their own culture, or are you trying to get them to assimilate? Second, incorporate diversity into your overall curriculum. 3, be intentional about creating a safe learning environment by utilizing ground rules. It's like making a classroom contract where there's an agreement between you and the students of how you're going to work together to create a positive and welcoming classroom culture. And this activity allows you to tell your expectations and also establish a safe, welcoming, and collaborative environment where these people can come as they are. Be proactive in connecting with and learning about your students. Meet and greets. Let the students get to know more about the teachers. Have some informal kind of interaction where you all can learn more about each other. What's in a name is an exercise I like to do. Allow the students and the teachers to learn more about each other, prompting questions to tell maybe the significance behind their name. Where's it from? Are you named after anybody? This helps you in these ways. Let them know that they can be themselves. 5, utilize a variety of teaching strategies, activities, and assignments that will accommodate the needs of students with diverse learning styles, abilities, backgrounds, and experiences. Be flexible. Use universal design principles to create accessible classrooms. For example, present information both orally and visually. Use different mediums to do it. When possible, provide flexibility in how students demonstrate their knowledge and how you assess their knowledge. Vary your assessments. Maybe you incorporate a blend of collaborative and individual assignments, or you might allow choice in assignments. Let the students have multiple projects to choose from, or let them determine the weight of each assignment on their final grade. 8, be clear about how the students will be evaluated and graded and provide justification for it. Some stuff is just too subjective. 9, take the time to assess the classroom climate by obtaining mid-semester feedback from your students. A lot of y'all don't know and maybe don't even care what you're creating in your classrooms, right? So maybe pass out inventories during class for anonymous feedback, or ask students to rate from 1 to 5 how comfortable they are in the class. Also ask for some suggestions from them about how they can feel more comfortable. I know on my level, we get assessments from the students every semester, and it's been very helpful to me to understand if I'm having my intended impact, because there's a difference between intent and impact often, right? And discuss your findings in class and share any changes you will make. That is it for my presentation. In closing, I'd like to reiterate these points. Dismantling inequity does not equal creating equity. There's work to be done to make sure that you create something after you've dismantled something. Also, that multicultural does not equal flags and pitches, right? Learning about and allowing all races to express themselves and be open to value and impact is what you want. We need to do more than decorate and have a production. We need to create an environment where these children feel seen, valued, and in contribution to the culture, that they matter, that their culture matters, that they matter. Okay? So thank you for the time to attend this workshop. These were our objectives. If you have any questions, I'm here for them. Thank you again. Hello, hello, hello. I hope you all enjoyed that session. I hope it was informative. I am here to answer any questions. I know there have been a couple, so I will start. I hate not being able to interact, but I know for sure that we have a question about microaggressions and that the definition was requested again. So microaggressions are often committed by well-intentioned people that aren't looking to hurt people's feelings, but nevertheless they do. And it creates a lot of frustration and anger for people, and sometimes it causes them to withdraw. And what the definition is brief and commonplace daily verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, right? Brief and commonplace verbal, behavioral, and environmental indignities, whether they're intentioned or unintentioned. And they communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults, right? So basically microaggressions, and we all do it in our own way, maybe not intending to hurt people's feelings, sometimes intended. But there are things that let people know that in a way it's like a slight put down or it's a slight dismissal. So I believe one of the examples I used was not pronouncing people's names properly. And because it was such a short session, I had a couple of videos to really bring home the point. And one was from an African woman, Uzumaka, who was on the Orange is the New Black, and how she wanted to change her name at one point to Liz or something like that. And her mother asked why, and she said because nobody could pronounce her name. And her mother said if they could pronounce Tchaikovsky and Michelangelo, then they can say your name, right? And so that's sometimes we have a tendency to dismiss people's names because they're not valid to us. They mean nothing to us. And so we're dismissing their heritage and their background when we do things like that, because everybody's name is picked with intention. Something that I do in live training sometimes is have people talk to each other about their name and how they receive their name, right? And nobody's name was just arbitrarily picked out of a hat. And particularly for a lot of ethnic names, they have a lot of deep meaning associated with them. And so for people to decide that their name is not important enough to learn, or they're not important enough for them to learn their name, is an example of a microaggression, right? It's not like you're saying to somebody, you don't matter, I don't care about you, but your behavior communicates that that's how you feel, right? And so we have to look at things like that. Who you cut off when they're trying to talk to you, who you're unwilling to acknowledge, who used to have a small comment about how they're dressed. Somebody has some ethnic food or something and you're like, oh, what's that, right? Those are microaggressions. They're little things that let people know that they don't, that there's something wrong with them, or that you don't like what they're doing, even if it wasn't what you meant to do. All right, hopefully that gives a little bit more. I know there's another question. If we focus on work-based learning, helping our young people have experience in the context of industry and work, what can we do to prepare for what racialized experiences they might have, not in the classroom, but out with a company or white mentor? Great question. Now, I would say that might depend on who the person is trying to prepare the student, right? Is it somebody of their race and ethnicity who might be able to give them real life situations and support around it that's empathetic, right? Because they understand where they're coming from, they've experienced it? Or is this someone who is in the majority that generally doesn't experience the same kind of discrimination or racial issues that they might, and then they're just trying to give some input, but it's not based on anything they know, right? So I would say from somebody who understands what they might be exposed to, that they give them some real life examples and also edify them. Let them know that whatever they come across is not about them, it's about the other person. Also maybe give them some ways to be able to stand in their own personal authority when they get in those kind of situations without being offensive, because there's a fine line you have to walk oftentimes when you are a person of color, and you're coming into a largely majority environment. There are masks we have to wear, there are lines you have to toe, you have to assess the environment, you have to be able to read what's said and what's not said. And so maybe teaching them some of those tricks of the trade that we all learn either by trial and fire or by somebody walking us through, would be great. If there's somebody who doesn't understand their experience, what you can let them know is that you'll be there to support them if they come across anything. And should they come across something, don't let anybody tell them that their feelings not valid, right? And maybe you can provide them with some resources for people they can go to, because it's really hard. Like, you can give definitions of what you heard and what you read and what you've done. If you've had moments where you weren't as enlightened as you are now, and what you've seen your friends do or you watched in the community, and you can let them know what might be expected that way, right? Because you've been in the rooms where the discussions have been had, even if you didn't agree with them. So you know how people look at people and judge them and whatnot. So you can help them that way, but you should also try to steer them towards somebody who truly understands and has learned how to navigate those spaces. What are the racial equity issues spoken and unspoken? Well, we did that one. How do we help educate and change the culture so this type of behavior does not continue? So here's the bad news, right? The behavior is going to continue. Sorry. What we can do or put things in place, what I always say is racism isn't going anywhere. Inequity is not going anywhere, not in any of our lifetimes, right? These are things that have been going on for 400 years or more, right? And if you ever get a chance, look up the 2008 speech of Dr. Joy DeGruy, DEGRUY, on post-traumatic slave disorder. There's lots of little snippets, but there's a 2008 version in London where it's an hour and a half, and you can learn about how much of the behaviors that Black people specifically go through are a result of slavery. And then there's stuff that's been passed on generationally, and there's a pathology among white people too, right? And there's a history that's bred, and there are things that are being unearthed again. Racism is here. How do we mitigate it? Is that you put practices and strategies in place to be able to work. And that's internal and that's external, right? Those are things that you have to do and learn. And there are things that should be put into the environment to allow people to be able to safely navigate in any space. And a lot of that would begin with people really, really being honest about what's the culture that's been created in their workspace, leisure activities, right? Because it's everywhere. And to look at themselves. And most people aren't willing to really be honest about who they are. And so, if you have the opportunity to bring people in and to help do the work in a way that doesn't make anybody wrong, right? It just shows what is, then we can start putting practical things in place to help the kids. and to help the culture, right? It's a long process. You may never get rid of the racism, but you can surely create a culture where there's an awareness around what's going on and steps are being taken to try to mitigate those things. What would be the best way to incorporate this in my engineering class? I think any class, a good way to incorporate these teachings is to talk to the children. Talk to the children about their experiences, about their life. Talk to them about how they feel about the material that you're presenting. Let them explain to you or learn some practical ways that the material can be used in their worlds, right? It's been noted that children, when they're giving assignments and when the work is shown how it can be applicable to their own personal lives, and when you give assignments that help them determine how that can be so, it has more impact, right? And so engineering, that's a pretty, it's a narrow demographic of people in engineering too, right? So there can be honest conversations around that. Be truthful with the children. Tell them what it is in these different spaces. Tell them what it's like in engineering. Tell them how they would have to navigate it. Ask them to come up with ways that they can inculcate into different environments, right? A lot of times we don't have to do the heavy lifting. These kids are smart and they know what's going on, and they are looking to have a voice. They're looking to be part of the solution, and they might be able to school you on things you didn't know. Because some of us, I don't care if you're 28, 29, to a 17-year-old, you're old, and you are out of touch with certain things. So allow the children to help you. The high school students we teach are future teachers. Let us pray. If they have to choose one thing we had to include in our work-based curriculum, if you had to choose one thing we had to include in our work-based curriculum, what would it be? I would say, and I mentioned this in the presentation, do something autobiographical. Now, I've taught many different classes under the guise of psychology, whether it was Black Psych, whether it was personal growth, intro courses, leadership and leadership, power, and I forgot what the third was, but I always have them do either something autobiographical or find someone that they admire and look into their life and see how they can relate to it. You want to find ways to learn more about your children so that you can have a curriculum that slides in little things to let them know that you paid attention to them, that what they have to offer matters, and also to help them either resolve or create a space where certain things can be talked about, right? And when you learn different things about your students, then that allows you to shape your curriculum in a way that's impactful to them, while you also might be able to help them with some issues they're having. They need to know that they're in a space where they belong, where they matter, where their experiences are, if not understood, at least there's a willingness for them to be examined and included. And then you learn and they learn. And it creates a partnership and a trust that allows for them to be more enrolled in what you're offering them in the class. Whew. I have 2 minutes left, which I would like to use. I see one last question. We have an on-site preschool, and when white children ask or notice a brown baby, how should the teacher respond? The child noticed the difference, and we wanted to respond. You get to acknowledge that it is a brown baby, and maybe you have different discussions about race. Kids get it, right? So yeah, that's a brown baby. That baby is whatever. That baby's Black. That baby's Hispanic. That baby's Middle Eastern. That baby's African. There are so many big parts of this world, and everybody looks different. And we get to learn about all the different people and their mommies. Let's find out where they come from. Let's look at the map. Like there's so many things you can talk about with them, and we're not going to ignore color and race and ethnicity. Like, to ignore that is to ignore who these children are. So you want to have the discussions, and you want to make it okay to have the discussions in an edifying, respectful way with children as young as possible. Okay, I'm 1 minute done. I want to thank all of you who did join and stayed and learn and your input. I also want to note that I made that presentation before I changed my website. So my website is now reinvention-solutions.com. And it's not Reinvention Now anymore. It's reinvention-solutions.com. And so if you want to come look for me, you can look for me over there. And if you go to Reinvention Now, I still have it, but it's more personal coaching things. If you want to find stuff around this or talk to me around things, you'll find it there. I thank you all. It's been amazing. I hope you got something out of it that you could take back to your schools. I hope that you all are looking to challenge yourselves and get further training as well. Have a wonderful rest of this NAF Next Be Future Ready conference. I'm Sharmayne Jenkins. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us today. Before you leave, a few quick things. The session evaluation and code are available right now on this platform. Please take a minute to give us your important feedback. It assists us in future conferences, and it will also help you in getting CEUs. Speaking of CEUs, if you're interested in getting those, for the sessions that you attended, that information will be provided to you as well. Don't forget to download the resources from this incredible session. And also be on the lookout in your email for an overall conference evaluation a few days following NAF Next. You'll also be excited to know that these sessions will be available for a year for you to watch again or to share with colleagues that may be in another session or were unable to attend NAF Next 2020. We hope to see you at NAF Next 2021 in Phoenix. Thanks again for joining us, and it's an honor to support each of you and together strive to prepare all of our students to be future ready. Have a great day.